Hello, I'm Ron Duncan Hart of the Santa Fe Distinguished Lecture Series, and I'd like to welcome you to the program today with Professor Avinoam Patt, who will be speaking about Yiddish humor. This is a fascinating story embedded in the history of Jewish life, and I think you'll find it remarkable. Before we start, I'd like to thank those of you for making these programs possible with your donations, and I would especially like to recognize Gloria Abella Ballin and Bonnie Ellinger for their indefatigable work on program planning and development. They have a critical role in developing ideas and evaluations of potential speakers, and thank you, Gloria and Bonnie. We're pleased to have Professor Patt, who is the Maurice Greenberg Professor of Holocaust Studies at New York University and the director of the Center for the Study of Antisemitism. He has published 7 books related to Holocaust studies and is a winner of the National Jewish Book Award for the book Laughter After, which is about humor and the Holocaust. He holds a BA in religion from Emory University and PhD in Hebrew and Judaic studies from New York University, and is a speaker of Yiddish, as you will know today. Professor Patt is a longtime friend of this distinguished lecture series, and he has lectured on a number of occasions in Santa Fe and online as it is today. Professor Patt, thank you for being here with us today.
All right. Thank you so much for that kind introduction, Ron. It's really a pleasure for me to be here today and to see everyone from Santa Fe and indeed the audience from around the world. So many friends and family gathered here together. So I'm just going to share my screen here. One second. So
Yes.
as you heard from the introduction, my remarks today are going to focus on the history of Yiddish humor, and we're going to look at the history of Yiddish humor and its journey from Eastern Europe to America, or as I've titled it, Shlemiels, Schnorrs, and Shalom Aleichem. And as you can see on the title slide, I refer to New York University by its Yiddish pronunciation and Vayu. By way of introduction, I thought it would be good to start a lecture on Yiddish humor with a joke. A traveler arriving in a Galician town orders a pair of trousers from a Jewish tailor. 3 months later, he leaves without the trousers. After 7 years, he happens to pass through the same place again, and lo and behold, the tailor comes to deliver the trousers. Well, the traveler exclaims, astounded, God created the world in 7 days, but you took 7 years for a pair of trousers. True, the Jew agrees, quite unimpressed, but look at the world and look at my trousers. So, we can reflect on this for a second as we think about sort of the origins of where Jewish humor comes from, or specifically as we're going to talk about sort of the Yiddish variant of Jewish humor, also while reflecting on the current state of our world and the Jewish tendency to engage in a dialogue with the creator of the world, but also to reflect on the state of creation at this moment in time. So when I teach this class and what I'm presenting to you today is a snippet from a semester-long class that I teach at NYU on Jewish humor. As you might imagine, it's a rather popular class, but one of the things that we do in the class is reflect on what is Jewish humor, how we define what is Jewish humor, who is the target audience for this type of humor, what makes Jewish humor Jewish, but also we reflect on what are the origins of that humor. Do we find its origins in the Torah, the Talmud? What defines Jewish humor throughout history? Does it emerge as a type of coping mechanism that Jews have developed in response to persecution and tragedy? Does it tend to be more intellectual than other forms of humor? It engages in a great deal of wordplay and the use of puns in observations and reflections on the meaning of words, which we'll see is something that is actually quite unique to Yiddish humor. Jews, as a multilingual people who speak multiple languages, might reflect on sort of the meaning or the funny sounds of different types of words. As we'll also see, of course, it deals with Jewish topics, But one of the interesting things to think about sociologically is that Jewish humor also helps Jews maintain a sense of otherness, of distinctiveness, of holding themselves apart from the outside world. At the same time, it is very often the humor of the outsider. That is, the outsider who at one and the same time is participating, is joining in perhaps engaging with the majority culture, but holds her or himself outside that majority culture and reflects from the perspective of the outsider on that majority culture. At the same time, as we'll see, Jews have used humor as a tool of both integrating and assimilating into the majority culture. So while at the same time reflecting on that culture from the perspective of the outsider, we'll see with the migration in particular of Jewish humor from Eastern Europe to America, how it gets used as a tool of integration and assimilation. Of course, some argue that the origins of Jewish humor we can trace all the way back to the Hebrew Bible, from the story of Abraham, when God promises Abraham that he will make of him a great nation and that his wife Sarah will give birth to a child. And of course, when Abraham goes to Sarah and says that she will have a child, Sarah knows that she is 99 years old and she knows how human biology works. She knows that she is way past childbearing age. And so her reaction to this news that she was going to give birth to a child is to laugh, or as the name of the child, Yitzchak or Isaac, we can see in the root of that name, Yitzchak, tzachak, to laugh. And some argue that we can see the origins of Jewish humor from the humor of the Bible. Of course, there are a lot of absurd situations in the Bible, but I would disagree with this tendency to look for the origins of Jewish humor in the Bible. Although there are some who say that we can go back to the Old Testament and see some of the first instances of this humor in the Bible, even from the time of the giving of the Ten Commandments. And here I actually have some video footage from the first giving of the commandments on Mount Sinai, and we can see the beginnings of Yiddish humor in this moment.
Moses went to the mountain, and God spoke unto him.
Moses, this is the Lord thy God, commanding you to obey my law. Do you hear me?
Yes, I hear you, I hear you. A deaf man could hear you.
What?
Nothing, forget it. Oh, Lord, why have you chosen me? What would you have me do for you?
I shall give you my laws, and you shall take them unto the people.
Yes, Lord. Lord, I shall give these laws unto thy people. Hear me. Oh, hear me. Oh, pay heed. The Lord Jehovah has given unto you these 15 10 commandments for all to obey.
Okay, so we can see here in this classic moment from History of the World Part One and Mel Brooks and the giving of the Ten Commandments or 15 Commandments, both the juxtaposition of that Mel Brooks old Jewish man voice, which we'll come back to later, but also we see the insertion of some Yiddish into this scene, which by itself is humorous to reflect on, and we'll talk in a second about where Yiddish comes from. But when God says, "Do you hear me?" and Mel Brooks as Moses says, "Yes, yes, a deaf man could hear you," and God says, "What?" And Mel Brooks or Moses responds, "Nothing, garnished," right? So even that in that moment, sort of the insertion of the Yiddish in that moment is humorous in and of itself, as is the exclamation when he drops the third tablet, the 10 through the 15th commandments, oi, right? So we can reflect on later how Brooks uses Yiddish in this moment to insert some humor into it. Of course, some have argued that one of the origins of where Jewish humor comes is in this sense of incongruity that Jews as a people feel between, on the one hand, being sort of thinking of themselves as God's chosen people, a holy people to Hashem. God has chosen you to be his treasured people from all the nations on the earth. And that incongruity between, on the one hand, being chosen by God or feeling a sense of chosenness by God, and the discrepancy, as Sarah Blacher Cohen refers to it, this vast discrepancy between being God's chosen people on the one hand and the desperate straits of the Jewish people, in particular in Eastern Europe in the 19th century. And Sarah Blacher Cohen, for one, argues that we can really trace the origins of Jewish humor not to sort of the Hebrew Bible per se, but that discrepancy between how Jews thought of themselves and their situation vis-a-vis the rest of the world, right? Thinking of yourself as the chosen people on the one hand, and being an experience of an oppressed and persecuted minority. But as Cohen also argues here, it is the plentiful emotional baggage, that humor, that Jews bring with them from the West to the East. And this idea of bringing it from the West to the East also helps us explain to a great extent sort of the origins of where Yiddish and Yiddish humor comes from. Now, of course, Jeremy Dauber, in his book Jewish Comedy: A Serious History, argues that Jewish humor or Jewish comedy has these 7 different categories, and this is how he organizes his book according to these different themes, being a response to persecution and anti-Semitism. Jewish comedy, he argues, takes a satirical gaze specifically at Jewish social and communal norms, and we'll come back to this idea of how Jews use comedy as a form of satire. He argues that it tends to be bookish, witty, intellectually elusive. It is vulgar, raunchy, and body obsessed, mordant, ironic, and metaphysically oriented, folksy, everyday part of the Jewish life. And as we'll see, it's often a reflection on the blurred and ambiguous nature of Jewishness itself. Now, of course, you'll notice that some of these categories, these are not mutually exclusive categories, that some of them can pertain to one situation but not to the other. Dauber constructs this sort of a definition of what is Jewish humor to try to allot for all the different forms of Jewish comedy as we see them. Now, to go back to what Sarah Blacher Cohen referred to as sort of the Jewish humor being the emotional baggage that Jews transported from the West to the East, we have to first understand where Yiddish as a language comes from. And it does not come from the destruction of the Second Temple in Jerusalem. Here, this image from the Arch of Titus. But it does help us to understand how it is that the Jews come to be dispersed first from the land of Israel. And specifically, we can trace back the settlement, the origins of Yiddish, to the settlement of the Jewish people in the German-speaking lands of Central Europe around the Rhine River specifically. Here we look at this map. You can see that the beginnings of Jewish migration from Central Europe and from the German-speaking lands to Poland and Lithuania begins in particular after the First Crusade, so after 1096. We see the beginnings of Jewish migration from the German Empire to Eastern Europe, where on the one hand, Jews are invited by Polish nobles in Poland and Lithuania to help them settle their lands and help them develop these vast agricultural estates. But what we see happening is as the Jews are leaving after the First, Second, and Third Crusades, they bring with them this Jewish language that is Judeo-German, and it is a fusion language that is a combination of medieval German, and as we'll see, it is a language that combines many different other languages. It has German, it has Hebrew words that come from Loshin Kodesh, and then depending on where Jews settle in different parts of Europe, it brings together either more Slavic words, Jews who are in, and you can see here on this map, I'll skip ahead here. One of the interesting things that we see in Yiddish, and you can see on this map, this Yiddish map that looks at the geographical distribution of Yiddish, is that there are actually multiple dialects of Yiddish that are spoken by Jews all over Europe that reflect this migration that takes place of the Jews from the German-speaking lands in particular. And again, I keep saying that because Germany, as a geographic category, the nation state of Germany doesn't come into existence till 1871. So we're talking about Jews who migrate from the Rhineland or from Bavaria or from Bohemia, Moravia, etc. But what we see is that this Judeo-German or Yiddish then evolves into certain different dialects depending on where the Jews live. So, for example, in Lithuania, you're going to have Litvaks who will have more Russian words. In some parts of the Yiddish-speaking world, you have more Polish words, Hungarian words. In Italy, you actually have more Latin words, etc., right? So that's what makes it a fusion language. One of the best ways to see how this works is to just look at some sample Yiddish sentences. So, for example, the first sentence, which Yiddish is, and I'll show you examples of this, is written in Hebrew characters, but for the purposes of transliteration, I've written it here in Latin characters. So, for example, that first sentence, Nach ein Bändchen der Seide gekäufte Sefer, is a perfect Yiddish sentence to show the fusion of multiple different languages. So what is Nach ein Bändchen der Seide gekäufte Sefer? So after reciting the prayers, Nach ein Bändchen, or literally the prayer after meals, der Seidi, the grandpa, hat gekauft, bought a Sefer, a book. But if you diagram the sentence and you look at the linguistic origins, you'll see that you actually have a combination of a number of different languages fused together here. So the noch and after comes from German, hat gekauft, the past tense of bought also comes from German. But then we see some interesting things happening here. So Zaidi for grandpa actually is Slavic in origin. Sefer for a book, or literally a holy book, is Loshin Kodesh, is Hebrew in origin. And Benchen, I don't know if anybody knows the origins of Benchen, but bench, literally to recite the grace after meals or to pray, actually is Latin in origin, just like benedictarian, benediction. Is the same root as benchen. So this is an example of, you can see how it's Yiddish, but it combines a number of different languages to form this Jewish language. What Sarah Blachar-Cohen also argues, though, is that the Yiddish humor of the late 19th century, in particular, which we're going to look at, defines the identity of the Jews of Eastern Europe. And this idea that she reflects on sort of the discrepancy between how they think of themselves and how the rest of the world thinks of them. The butt of a cruel joke, they found that God had singled them out to be a light unto the nations, but had given them a benighted existence. Powerful in interpreting the vast complexities of sacred texts, they were powerless in their dealings with brainless peasants. Priding themselves on the cohesiveness of their private world, they felt isolated from the world at large. To cope with anxiety produced by these incongruities, they created a humor in which language, laughter, and trembling were inextricably linked. And we can see this sort of as a defining feature of Yiddish humor, this incongruity that I've referred to. Another way to see this working is, again, through a joke. So you can look at this joke and you can think about how Jews reflect on them vis-a-vis the other Europeans reflected in this joke. 4 Europeans go hiking together and they get frightfully lost. First, they run out of food. Then they run out of water. I'm so thirsty, says the Englishman. I must have tea. I'm so thirsty, says the Frenchman. I must have wine. I'm so thirsty, says the German. I must have beer. I'm so thirsty, says the Jew. I must have diabetes, right? So this is, on the one hand, a classic Jewish joke, but it's also a reflection on the nature of Jewish identity vis-a-vis these other national groups. So on the one hand, you can see sort of these stereotypes. A joke has to work quickly with stereotypes of different national groups and who drinks what. But the Jew, first of all, doesn't self-define as a drinker, But second of all, is labeled as neurotic, right? As like, why am I thirsty? What is possibly making me thirsty? It's not about thirst. It's about that I must have something wrong with me. In this case, not I must have tea, wine, or beer, but I must have diabetes. And I think this is a good point for us to reflect on sort of what are the functions of humor. Now, on the one hand, humor is universal, right? So you will have many groups that think of themselves as funny, although we can reflect on sort of why Jews think of themselves as funnier than other groups. I'll get back to that. But we also know that humor is something that we can trace through all humans and indeed in certain primates, right? So there are biological functions of humor and specifically play. Biologically, it's important. It's good for you, right? Both through the release of endorphins, but it also has a social function. On the one hand, it can bring people together, right? It can also divide people. It can play a role in sort of being an icebreaker and facilitating social situations. Um, it also can perform important psychological functions, right? It can be cathartic, it can be therapeutic, and it can be aggressive and or self-deprecating. And perhaps one of the early greatest theorists of humor and the functions of humor was this Shena Punim, Sigmund Freud, who in his book, Wit and Its Relation to the Unconscious, reflects a great deal on trying to understand sort of what is the function of humor. And what Freud argues is that humor can form as a type of a catharsis for repressed hostilities, that it's a way of sort of channeling anger. So if you think about sort of like how Freud's interest in how dreams work and what are the subconscious emotions, he was also quite interested in trying to figure out sort of what humor can tell us about what is going on in our subconscious, right? What do we not feel comfortable saying sort of directly, and how do we use humor to express things indirectly that we can't express things directly? But he also says that humor is important because it serves as a type of a release valve. As Freud argues, that people tend to laugh because they want to get rid of pent-up energy. And as he argues, what we tend to laugh at are things that we're often that we are repressed. So it could be things that people are angry about. It could be about sort of taboo sexual topics or other taboo topics. And he spends a lot of time analyzing jokes and its and wit and its relation to the unconscious. And then at some point, as he's analyzing these jokes, he realizes that he's actually, for the most part, analyzing Jewish jokes. As someone in Vienna, as part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, looking at jokes that are created by Jews, probably mostly Galicianers in the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And he observes about Jewish jokes. I do not know whether there are many other instances of a people making fun to such a degree of their own character. And this is where we get this observation that Jewish humor tends to be a real self-deprecating humor, that this is something that really distinguishes Jewish humor, as Freud says, of Jews making fun of themselves to such a degree, or as Martin Grosjean argues, that it's a defense mechanism because before they can be persecuted by the others, Jews will make fun of themselves before the other can make fun of them, and then be even more effective at making fun of themselves than the other could be. So it's as he argues, the Jewish joke constitutes victory by defeat, right? I will make fun of myself before you can make fun of me. I'm going to skip over for now analysis of the many different categories of humor. We can reflect on this later: irony, satire, sarcasm, exaggeration, self-deprecation, teasing, which tends to be more aggressive and externally focused, clever replies, which is a defining feature of Jewish humor, double entendres, which we're going to see a lot in Yiddish humor, as I'll show you in a little bit, and wordplay and puns. We also see this a lot in Yiddish humor. One of the, early places that we see sort of the functioning of Yiddish humor is through the Helm stories, for example, right? Where we see both like this absurdist nature of Yiddish humor, but also sometimes this wrestling with the nature of Jewish identity itself. So, for example, if you look at the second joke here on the page, two Helm sages, two sages of Helm went out for a walk. One carried an umbrella, the other didn't. Suddenly it began to rain. Open your umbrella quick, suggested the one without an umbrella. It won't help, answered the other. What do you mean it won't help? It will protect us from the rain. It's no use. The umbrella is as full of holes as a sieve. Then why did you take it along in the first place? I didn't think it would rain. All right, so this is on the one hand an absurdist joke, but it's also a classic Chalm story that sort of makes fun of the Chalmites and their inability to understand the functioning of the world. By the way, there are many cultures that have these towns of fools, right? It's not uniquely Jewish. It functions across different cultures, but there's a lot of debate as to sort of why Chelm for the Jews, because Chelm was a real place. It is a real place in Poland. It had a sizable Jewish community. And the theory is that Chelm, which is in Yiddish is spelled Chaf Ein Lamed Mem, might have reminded the Jews of the Hebrew word for dream, chalom, and perhaps this is sort of where the idea of like the Chalmites being dreamers. The second one, actually the one on the bottom of the page, we see as a Jewish joke that's repeated in lots of places. The rabbi of Chelm and one of his Talmud students were spending the night at the inn. The student asked the servant to wake him at dawn because he was going to take an early train. The servant did so. Not wishing to wake the rabbi, the student groped in the dark for his clothes, and in his haste, he put on the long rabbinical gabardine. He hurried to the station, and as he entered the train, he was dumbstruck with amazement as he looked at himself in the compartment mirror. What an idiot that servant is, he cried angrily. I asked him to wake me. Instead, he went and woke the rabbi. There's a lot of variations of this joke where we see sort of somebody stumbling in the dark and they wake up the wrong person. There is a brilliant Shalom Aleichem story, which I'm going to get to in a little bit, called Ibra Hittel, about a hat or on account of a hat, where Shalom Aleichem inverts the structure of this joke actually to make a rather profound sort of observation on the nature of Jewish life in Eastern Europe. You also have in sort of early Yiddish folklore stories like the adventures of Herschel Osterpol or Herschel Osterpolier. This is one, that's called, I'll Do What My Father Did is essentially the story. I'm not going to read the whole thing right now. But what's interesting about Herschel Osterpolier is that this seems to be based on a real person, Herschel of Osterpol, who was a badchen. A badchen means this was a position of somebody who was a jokester, a prankster, who was appointed to a Hasidic Rebbe's court. And their job was to entertain people, to make people laugh, to bring merriment. And so, for example, at a wedding, the badchen would entertain people, and it was sort of considered a great mitzvah to bring joy to the bride and the groom, and so the badchen would bring joy to the bride and the groom. And this shows us that there is a value, a commandment to having sort of puns and jokes and funny components to everyday life, right? And so I think this is important for us to understand, sort of like in Yiddish culture, in Yiddish society, where this position exists within the society. Of course, we have lots of examples in Yiddish folklore of this Yiddish wit, this Yiddish wisdom, which is very, very colorful, right? So I'm not going to go through all of these, but this one I had on the cover slide, Oib, and you can see also how Yiddish is written here, Oib de Bob volt gehat a bord, volt ze gewen a zedi. If grandma had a beard, she would be a grandpa. This is actually not a joke necessarily about cross-dressing. This is a joke where you would use as a response to someone to say like, that is impossible, that won't happen. Like, yeah, right, as if. And you would say like, oh yeah, right. And if grandma had a beard, she'd be a grandpa. Like, this is, what you're telling me is not true. Or one of my favorites, Tu on a chazer a streimel vetter a rov. If you put a streimel, right, like a Hasidic fancy headgear on a pig, would it make him a rabbi? This is very, very colorful, right? Which is essentially to point out that even those who might present themselves as pious may not be as pious as they seem, or don't just dress up there's much a deeper value to sort of being pious than just what you wear externally, right? Um, another one, which I often tell myself because I'm trying to do too many things at the same time. Mit ein Tuches kann man nicht tanzen auf zwei Chasanas. You can't dance at two weddings with one behind. You can only be at one place at a time, right? Again, I'm just showing you this to evoke the very colorful nature of Yiddish wit and wisdom, and to think about sort of these linguistic turns of phrase, right? So a toches is a behind, and chasanas, right? So you have like sort of not only the rhyme scheme, but also the wisdom that is embedded in this colorful saying. Um, and again, there's a lot of these, but I'm gonna skip ahead. Another one, b'makom she'en bo ish, is a herring or a fish, literally big fish in a small pond. Where there is no worthy man, even a herring can be considered a fish, but it's much better in Yiddish, and it rhymes, and it's very, very colorful. Now, one of the amazing things that happens in the 19th century, where we see sort of this humor beginning to emerge in Eastern Europe, is, and I think it is to a large extent, sort of a product of the encounter between the Enlightenment and Western democratic ideals, liberal political ideals, the Enlightenment thinking, the possibility of emancipation, which is moving from Western Europe to Eastern Europe, and the encounter that takes place between this Jewish Enlightenment, the Haskalah, and the sort of rich nature of East European Jewish life, where you see figures who are wrestling with, on the one hand, the promises of enlightenment, on the other hand, the continuing nature of persecution in the form of pogroms, and wrestling with the question of how will Jews become modern? How will Jews enjoy the fruits of this so-called modern world while maintaining their Jewish identity? Is there a way to navigate this process? And I think the sort of experts at trying to help Jews decipher this process of maintaining a distinctive Jewish identity, of some sort of allegiance to the core tenets of what it means to be Jewish while being modern, we can see through these great writers of Haskalah literature and modern Yiddish literature. In particular, here you can see the big three: Mendele Mocher Svarim, Mendele the book peddler, Shalom Abramovich in the middle. On the right on my screen, Shalom Aleichem, Shalom Rabinovich, who I'll spend some time talking about, and on the left, Yud Lamed Peretz. And through these three, we see both the use of Yiddish literature and a good deal of humor to try not only to satirize the nature of Jewish life, but also to use humor as a coping mechanism to help Jews wrestle with the nature of the transition from tradition to modernity. And in particular, Shalom Aleichem is sort of the ultimate in trying to help Jews navigate this process. So I'm sure most of you are most familiar with Shalom Aleichem through the character of Tevye. Here you can see Chaim Topol from the 1970 film, the iconic playing the iconic character. Although what's super interesting, and I would encourage everyone to go back and read the original Tevye stories, which the best translation I think is the Hillel Halkin translation. You can see what Shalom Aleichem is able to do in creating this character, who essentially we follow him over the course of about 25 years of his life, from the 1890s up until really Shalom Aleicham's death in 1916, as he navigates this process of maintaining his faithfulness, his adherence to tradition, with his love for his daughters, which represent some different type of change. But how does Shalom Aleichem sort of navigate this process of, on the one hand, sort of unleashing the potential of Yiddish language which he puts into literature with maintaining his Yiddish literature? Well, he does something very interesting, which is a very neat trick. And you can see here in the first story as an example, Tevye strikes it rich. And so I'll just read for you in the beginning. If you're meant to strike it rich, Pan Shalom Aleichem, you may as well stay home with your slippers on, because good luck will find you there too. The more it blows, the better it goes, as King David says in his Psalms. And believe me, neither brains nor brawn has anything to do with it, and vice versa. If it's not in the cards, you can run back and forth till you're blue in the face. Okay, so by the way, this character of Shalom Aleichem does not stop. This character of Tevye does not stop talking. But what does Shalom Aleichem do here to unleash the potential of Tevye to talk and specifically to speak in Yiddish? Well, he designs a structure where every single story is Shalom Aleichem, the writer, running into his old friend Tevye, but the whole story is Tevye telling us a story, Tevye talking. And because Yiddish until then doesn't have a literary tradition, it just has an oral spoken tradition. By being basically a storyteller, Tevye is, the whole thing is told just as if someone would talk. So it's actually rather a brilliant way to make sure that the Yiddish that is written on the page sounds like the Yiddish that one would hear in everyday life, right? And then it enables Tevye to function in this way. So, for example, this is in the first story where he describes himself sort of going along in his horse and buggy, delivering his dairy products, and wanting to wanting at the same time to say his prayers. But the way he describes it is he's trying to say his prayers, and all of a sudden the horse takes off. And so he's in a word. There I was running behind the wagon and singing the Shemina Esrei like a cantor in a synagogue. Mechalkel chaim bechesed, who provideth life with his bounty. It better be all of life. Do you hear me? Umekayim amunasei shenei ofar, who keepeth faith with them who slumber in the earth, who slumber in earth. Now what we see here is this dynamic that Tevye has with God, where yes, he's faithful, yes, he's saying the prayers, but he's also not afraid to wrestle with God, to argue with God, to fight with God, to complain about the situation of the life in which he is living. And so this shows us the dynamic of how Shalom Aleichem unleashes the potential of Yiddish, but also uses humor to help Tevye, as David Roskies describes it, laughter through tears, to help Tevye use humor as a coping strategy for all the difficult aspects of his life. By the way, Shalom Aleichem is buried in Queens. So if anybody wants to go visit the grave of Shalom Aleichem, he moves during the First World War. He moves to New York, and supposedly his funeral in 1916, as they take his casket through the streets of New York, was the largest funeral that the city had ever seen. Something like 250,000 people come out to pay tribute, pay their respects to the great writer, Shalom Aleichem. So this is a picture of his gravestone at the Mount Carmel Cemetery in Queens. Now, in the time that I have left, what I want to do is reflect then on what happens to Yiddish, exactly sort of as we see this process of migration from Eastern Europe to America. And of course, like we have all these Yiddish words, which you can see on the screen, which make their way into the English language. And a lot of people will sort of instinctively, I think, chuckle when they hear Yiddish words, maybe because they sound funny, right? These are letter combinations, lots of consonants put together that don't sound natural in English. So that's a funny part of it. But also we know that sort of one generation to the next, Yiddish would be used as a code language, which things were inappropriate or things were secret or things were adult jokes would be told that the young people, they didn't want them to understand. So I think this also conditions a certain extent the idea of sort of Yiddish being a humorous language. I'm going to skip over a section that I have here on sort of Yiddish and the Holocaust, which is a whole other topic that I would love to talk about some other time, Ron. How Jews use Yiddish during the war as a way of coping with persecution. This is a volume that's published in 1947 called Gelächter durch Tränen, Laughter Through Tears. Humorous and satirical creations created in post-war Poland, right? So you might reflect on like what could that possibly be? And yet we can see in this sort of Jews still using humor during the war and in the aftermath of the war to reflect on the nature of life after the war. But I'll skip this for now because I want to spend a few minutes thinking about what happens to Yiddish in America. So you can see here that we have this period of the Great Migration from Eastern Europe to America, where if you look at the period from 1881 to 1920, the Jewish population in America goes up from 250,000 to 3.5 million. And this is a period of mass migration of Jews from Eastern Europe to America, where you have a lot of Yiddish-speaking immigrants who come to America. And in Mel Brooks's imagination, they run into Yiddish-speaking Native American chiefs. If you remember Blazing Saddles, where the chief sort of speaks Yiddish and says, to let the characters pass forward, Lozim gain. But one of the things that's fascinating about sort of the nature of Jewish humor in America, and this is one of the things I spent a lot of time in my class on, is we can see sort of the linguistic migration that takes place, where in the first phase, we have the Jewish immigrants, a huge percentage of whom end up on the Lower East Side of Manhattan, where we see sort of a thriving Yiddish folklore, Yiddish culture, Yiddish theater on the Lower East Side develop into vaudeville acts in which Jewish themes are quite present, performing for large audiences, again, for the most part, in this case, on the Lower East Side of Manhattan. And those skills that are developed in vaudeville, we see then transforming and manifesting in early film comedies like the Marx Brothers, Three Stooges, and others. But in these films, and I'll show you an example of this, we see how Jewish themes go hidden or are encoded. And then when Jews begin to go to the vacation resorts of the Borscht Belt in the period in particular, actually before World War II and after World War II, we see this category of the tumler, of the performer, of the comedian who is entertaining the guests there, which helps explain why we have such a huge disproportionate number of Jews overrepresented in Jewish comics, overrepresented in these new cultural forms of radio and television, where you need material, you need content. And we see these tumblers, Jewish comics, and stand-up comedians performing there. And then we see stand-up comedy, which emerges from the Borscht Belt, in particular in the 60s and 70s, where something like 75% of all the stand-up comedians performing in America in the 1970s and into the 1980s, 75% are Jews, right? Who we can trace this sort of lineage, again, from migration to the Lower East Side to the Borscht Belt to stand-up comedy. And it's quite interesting then to reflect on what we see over the last 30, 40 years on television, and then what we see today and what I refer to as the golden age of Jewishness on TV. This is a map of the Lower East Side and different Nickelodeons and vaudeville spots on the Lower East Side of Manhattan. I'll skip this for now. The Vorwärts, just to give you a sense of the richness of Yiddish culture, 250,000 copies at least a day. It's the largest circulation daily, right? Gives you a sense of sort of the size of the readership. And then again, if we think about Jews in vaudeville, just to name a few of those who get their starts performing in vaudeville, Edward Israel Iskovitz, aka Eddie Cantor, Asa Yoelson, Al Jolson, right? And by the way, it's not coincidental that the first talkie, which is the jazz singer, it actually deals with very Jewish content, right? But it is not a happy story. It's about a son who Jake Rabinowitz, Jack Robin, who wants to be a jazz singer, but his father is a chazan and he wants him to be a cantor. And it is that tension between sort of tradition and modernity. Henny Youngman, another example, right? So Henny Youngman is like a perfect example of sort of that wit that we see, I told the doctor I broke my leg in two places. He told me to quit going to those places, right? Um, what's that use of happiness? It can't buy you money, right? Like sort of this inversion that takes place that if we think back to that Yiddish wit, but it comes up with alternate endings that the audience doesn't expect. Nathan Birnbaum, uh, Benjamin Kubelski, right? Sophie Kalish, Fania Borach, right? I'm just showing you sort of who some of these people, Milton Berlinger, right? These are the people who get their start in vaudeville. I want to spend, I hope the video works here. We'll see. You can, even if you see, so this is from Duck Soup, I believe. And
Not playing Ask Me Another. I say that's a viaduct.
All right, why a dog? It's why a dog? Why no chicken?
I don't know why no chicken. I'm a stranger here myself. All I know is that it's a viaduct. You try to cross over there in a chicken and you'll find out viaduct.
okay, so that's a perfect example of Groucho and Chico, right? Both children of Jewish immigrants in this case, sort of playing this part of reflecting, in this case, using sort of the Yiddish linguistic sentiment to reflect on wordplay, right? So instead of viaduct, which is the word that they're talking about, in a Yiddish pronunciation sounds like viaduct, right? Viaduct, viaduct, right? So again, simple bit, but you can see sort of this idea of using sort of Yiddish linguistic hearing to reflect on funny words that
Here is a little
in English. Um, uh, the other thing that we see Groucho doing in this case in Duck Soup, where he plays Rufus Firefly, is actually playing sort of somebody who becomes the ruler of Fredonia, completely unqualified to be the ruler of this country. I can't imagine a situation that we would encounter something like this. But also sort of like the idea of the outsider who uses his wit to poke fun at those who are in the aristocracy, those who are in power, those who are, in his opinion, completely sort of illegitimate. And so we see like this use of humor. But again, if we reflect on sort of the Yiddish speaker, who both can use that sentiment and that sensibility to be an outsider and an insider at the same time, using Yiddish in that sense. Okay, is that working there? Let's just see if the video is working here. No, I think it's when I do part of screen, but that's okay. So again, as I was reflecting on like one of the things that we can see happening is then this period of time where Jews are going to live so Jews are going to summer vacations in the Borscht Belt. And again, Jerry Lewis reflects on this when he thinks about sort of his role as a tumler, right? His role as somebody who is just there to entertain people as they are sort of to distract them from the low quality of the food or the poor quality of their accommodations. The accommodations and the food might not be great, but hopefully the entertainment is great. And we can see sort of a list of a who's who of comedians who get their start regularly performing in Borscht Belt resorts, right? And again, like this helps us account for the overrepresentation of Jews in the field of stand-up comedy, which is a uniquely American Jewish art form that emerges from this period of time. And what's interesting is because we see sort of these tumblers are performing the Borscht Belt, and then the timing of these new technologies like radio. So you have Gertrude Berg or Molly Goldberg, right? Sort of bringing this sensibility of entertaining mass audiences first through radio and then through television, or Sid Caesar, who is the master, right, of doing something which actually, if you see this picture here where he plays the German general, he is the master of using something that he calls double speak or double talk, where it sounds like he's speaking a foreign language. In the case of the German general, it's almost all Yiddish. But to the audience, he is making fun of a German while speaking Yiddish to the audience at the same time. I'll just play a bit of this here. Ah. All right. It's for some reason it's not playing, but I will share the links with you, and I encourage you to listen to it later. Or another perfect example of this is what Mel Brooks and Carl Reiner do in The 2,000-Year-Old Man. Again, this is just the sound version of this, but I'll play a little bit of this. You can see sort of how we hear the Yiddish sort of like the accent and the dialect, but is used for comedic purposes with the audience.
He spent the last 6 days at the Mayo Clinic. Sir, is it true that you are 2,000 years old?
Oh, boy. Yes.
You are it's hard to believe, sir, because in the history of man, nobody's ever lived more than 167 years, as the man from Peru would claim to be. But you claim to be 2,000.
Yes, I'm not yet. I'll be 2000 October 16th. Yes.
You will be 2,000. When were you born?
We didn't have form.
Okay. You get the idea, right? This idea, but again, just kind of like Moses on Mount Sinai, the 2,000-year-old man sounds like an old Yiddish speaker, right? And this sounds funny to a broad American audience, right? And what Reiner and Brooks do, Reiner always plays the straight man, and it's all improvised, right? But sort of the setup there of like the refined sort of almost like American broadcaster Carl Reiner juxtaposed in an incongruous sense with the Yiddish sounding old man that Mel Brooks plays, right? That also creates the humor, the comedy. Another example of this that we see is the way that Jackie Mason also creates sort of a persona that is a heavily accented persona, right? So here's an example of it.
Howdy do, howdy do. Certainly is a great thrill for you to see me. How are you? I really hope I enjoy the show. I am a very big star, but nobody seems to know about it. I don't know if you heard about it. Not too many people seem to know what I do for a living. But I happen to be a great performer, too. I'm not...
All right, so that's one example. Another example, we can see...
I'm going to line 100 men up against the wall.
It's not playing in the right part. Anyway, Bell Barth does this as well. And then Lenny Bruce, in his comedy, begins to reflect on sort of the difference between what it means to be Jewish and what it means to be Goyish, right? And we can start to see sort of this evolution of reflecting on Jewish identity, but and then also using what to him sounds like a very sort of hip language, which is using Yiddish, but using Yiddish as sort of a type of a slang that is hip. So reflecting on the distinction between Jewish and Goyish, right? Kool-Aid is Goyish, Drake's cakes are Goyish, pumpernickel is Jewish, white bread is Goyish, instant potatoes Goyish, black cherry soda, very Jewish, macaroons, very, very Jewish cake, fruit salad Jewish, lime jello Goyish, lime soda, very Goyish, right? Sort of this reflecting again between Jewish and Goyish, but also how it begins to help Jews conceive of sort of what is authentic, what is true, what is real, and what reflects categories of assimilation into broader mainstream, consumer American culture. I will skip ahead. If we think about like Woody Allen and Annie Hall, again, this is a case where we start to see sort of this reflecting on what is it that makes someone Jewish. And he actually uses this line that Groucho Marx has to describe the nature of his relationship with women, and in particular Annie Hall, if she represents a non-Jewish woman, the idea of the shiksa, that I would never want to belong to a club that would have anyone like me as a member. And this sort of notion of a self-deprecating sense of identity. In the 1980s, when we think about sort of television, one of the things that's interesting that happens is we still have these sort of very Jewish characters that often use sort of Yiddish accents, but are not Jewish on TV. So like the Golden Girls, as an example, they're supposed to be Italian B. Arthur and Estelle Getty, these very Jewish characters, but Italian is code for Jewish ethnicity. Um, and even on a show like Seinfeld, right, where Jerry is the Jewish character, the Costanzas, played by Jerry Stiller, for example, as George Costanza's father, very, very Jewish stereotype, but still, as Jerry Stiller referred to them, we were Jews in witness protection in Queens pretending to be Italians. And one of the interesting things, and again, I think this clip won't work for now, but that Seinfeld reflects on is, can one convert in order to convert to Judaism for the jokes? I think it's because of the way I'm doing this share. What I'll end with is thinking about sort of what Yiddish humor looks like today. So you can have scenes like in Curb Your Enthusiasm, where you have Larry basically sort of not able to speak Yiddish, and so completely losing access to the Yiddish language. I'm going to skip it for now. Um, to sort of like some occasions where you have very Jewish comedians like a Modi Rosenfeld using Yiddish quite consciously in terms of how they will use Yiddish material, or someone like Elon Gold also who will use very Jewish language or yeshivish language. Or one of my favorite examples is the guys from Yid Life Crisis, who have basically created a YouTube series where they perform in Yiddish. So I managed to get through all of my 114 slides, and I hope this gives us some sense for the evolution of sort of Yiddish and Yiddish comedy, how it's gone from Eastern Europe all the way to America, but also for us to reflect on what is lost and what is gained in the midst of this sort of transition between the two. Ron, I will stop myself there, and hopefully I've left enough time for some questions.
Yes. Let's see. All right. You can see the questions. Do you want to go directly to them?
Sure. So I see Eitan and Anat, my colleagues from UConn. Hi, Eitan and Anat. Nice to see you here. So I have a feeling, I don't know if it's Eitan or not, wrote Benchen. One of my students once wrote, אחרי האוכל אנחנו misafsalim, or mispalalim, I would imagine, which is sort of, again, like thinking about, like, instead of davening or bench mispalalim, but also the sort of the Yiddishization of the saf, the taf, right? We pray. Leniza Menda says, is Israeli humor different from Jewish humor? Are there similarities between these two kinds of humor? I love that question. And this is something that I do talk about in the class, sort of, is Israeli humor Jewish humor? And the short answer is yes. But it actually is, I find it to be quite different in interesting ways. I mean, one of the things that we can see is, so let's say you take a Jewish humor sensibility, but then you adapt it to the context within which you are living. So you could have a Jewish humor sensibility that adapts to the American context, and I think you have a Jewish humor sensibility that adapts to the Israeli context. So we see a lot of Israeli humor that is used to satirize politicians in the Israeli context, or to reflect on the nature of Jewish life in Israel. One of the things I wrote about in the book Laughter After Humor and the Holocaust is a comparison of American and Israeli sketch comedy, which I think is quite fascinating in the ways that it works. I'm interested specifically in Israeli and American sketch comedy about the Holocaust. There's a great show in Israel that's called The Jews Are Coming, or HaYehudim Baim, which it requires a great deal of knowledge about Jewish history, because it basically creates satirical sketches about episodes in Jewish history all the way from the time of the Bible almost to the present day. And it's a very Jewish humor, but that basically sort of requires a deep level of knowledge about the nature of Jewish history. Diane Schmidt says, what does your understanding of humor and history tell you about why Trump is going after comedians? First of all, it tells me that he has no sense of humor. That's the first thing. And that's quite important, right? To think about like the danger of sort of thinking of yourself in such a way that you have no sense of humor. But the other thing is that if we think about humorists and comedians playing an important social function as being the critics, as being the ones who sort of speak truth to power, which is one of the few places that we could see this happening right now, then yes, I think that it signifies some fear and some sense of vulnerability about those who would sort of expose hypocrisy or speak truth to power in this context. Um, Gary Ray Gray says, please repeat the names of the three Jewish writers by all means. So when I was talking about late 19th century, sort of the greats of modern Yiddish literature, the big three from that period of time is Mendele the book peddler, or Mendele Mocher Svarim. That literally means Mendele the bookseller. And his real name, Mendele was his pen name, his real name was Shalom Abramovich, and this is confusing, Shalom Aleichem, who is the best of the bunch and the greatest writer in my opinion. Shalom Aleichem was Shalom Rabinovich, and his pen name was Shalom Aleichem, which literally means, "Hey, how you doing?" or peace be upon you. Literally, that was his pen name, and a lot of people compared Shalom Aleichem to Mark Twain, right? So somebody who was folksy, who understood the people, who could use humor to deliver important messages. And apparently they knew each other. They read each other's work, which says something. And then the last one was Yud Lamed Peretz, or Isaac Leib Peretz, Peretz. Okay. Okay, another question here. This is about many comedians of color mark the behavior of white people, making fun of how whites respond to people of color. Perhaps I'm wrong, but it seems that Jewish comics don't have the freedom to mock non-Jews and Christians like people of color. I mean, okay, this is fascinating. It does. So you remember that last category of Dauber that had sort of using humor to reflect on the ambiguous nature of Jewish identity itself? I mean, there is like this question of, who are Jews and where do Jews situate themselves? And in the American context, one of the confusing aspects of the American context is so much is divided along racial categories between black and white. But then this question of where do Jews fit in, or are Jews white? Of course, there are many Jews who are not white. Tiffany Haddish is an example of a Jewish comic who also identifies as Jewish and black, right? So, like, where does one situate themselves in that context? And I think one of the interesting things is when we see Jewish comedians, and I think we'll see more of this now, reflecting either on anti-Semitism in particular, it is also a way of reflecting on sort of this idea of using humor to cope with the ambiguities or the confusion of the present moment. So I think that's an interesting question that raises a lot. Ron, should I keep going, or? I see Marilyn has a question here.
Yes, go with it. Yeah.
Yes. Hi, Marilyn. Nice to not to hear from you, not to see you directly, but Marilyn, I'll just say I'm a big fan of the work of Eduardo Chalfon, and Marilyn has a great book about Eduardo Chalfon. And Marilyn asks, as a Latin Americanist, I'm wondering if there is Ladino humor, or perhaps Ladino humor and Yiddish humor. Oh, this is a great question. So yes, I focus specifically. Okay, so a little shout out for another book that I've co-edited that is going to be coming out in spring of 26, which is called Wit Happens: Global Approaches to Jewish Humor. And one of the things, Marilyn, that we've done in this volume with my co-editors, Jenny Kaplan and Jared Tanny, is to reflect on the global nature of Jewish humor And of course, it's not just a Yiddish thing, and it's not just an Ashkenazi thing. That one of the things that we see when we start to look at global Jewish humor is that there are lots of examples of Jews as a minority, and I think this is part of what you're getting at here. Jews as a minority with their own language. So, for example, Judeo-Espanol, or Jews who spoke Judeo-Arabic, or Yiddish is Judeo-German, essentially, right? Like, so how Jews can use Yiddish or their own code languages to poke fun at the majority society, right? To have a coded language to speak amongst themselves, but also reflect on the comic nature of what they observe around them. Um, and yeah, I think Yiddish is a tool to combat anti-Semitism in our own times. Um, I love so I didn't have a chance to show it, and Eitan points out to me that it probably, if I had logged out of the PowerPoint and logged back in, I could have shared the videos. But as an example, I think it happens when you share a portion of the screen. The Yid Life Crisis guys have an episode called an anti-Semitish episode. And it's their reflection on, somebody spray paints a swastika on a cement block in a public park in Montreal, and their comment is that this is not just anti-Semitish, about this is like anti-Semitish, right? So it's both anti-Semitish and anti-Semitish. So yes, you could definitely use sort of Yiddish humor as a way of responding to anti-Semitism. But again, think about what that works. What that does functionally is it means that you are using sort of insider language, Jewish language that perhaps only other Jews would understand, to speak amongst Jews speaking amongst themselves, kind of a rally circle the wagons, right? Circling the wagons by using coded Jewish language as a way of defending against persecution. Um, so many Yiddish words and it's interesting that somebody asked anonymous attendee Yiddish words for a stupid man, um, but they also mean different things, right? So like a schlemiel versus a schlemazel, it actually mean different things. One is somebody who is, I guess the English word is a nincompoop, right? Versus, which is not probably not an English word, versus a schlemazel is actually somebody who has bad luck, right? So it's interesting, like you can have, it's like the Eskimo words for snow. You can have different words reflect on different categories of, there could be somebody who's stupid and foolish versus somebody who just is gullible versus somebody who has really bad luck, right? What Yiddish is so colorful, it has different words for all those things. By the way, right, if we think about the functions of Yiddish in the English language, a lot of the slang that we see from the early 20th century, so like Yiddish words for male genitalia, which make their way into English, right, like schmuck and putz, right? Um, those are, again, you're using slang to say words that you wouldn't say in polite society, but you can use Yiddish slang to say, to use those words, right? So you can think about how that works. I would add Schmendrick to the list above of Shlemiel, Shlemazl, Schmendrick. Eitan typed in Masaf Salim. Can you recommend any? Oh yeah, joke books. I would definitely recommend Born to Kvetch by Michael Wex. Very good for Yiddish language learners. That'd be a great one. Um, so that's one example. Oh, and Ruth Weiss has a really good book, No Joke, Making Jewish Humor, which I also recommend. And then obviously Bill Novak, father of BJ Novak from The Office, and Moshe Waldogs have the Big Book of Jewish Humor, which also has a lot of this original Yiddish humor. And I see here, for example, and I didn't have a chance to talk about this, but Marcia Bronstein says, what about female Jewish writers and comedians through history? Um, yes, there's so much to talk about here. You know, also playing, so like you have the Gertrude Berg example of the persona of the Yiddish mama, the Jewish mother. So you have people who play that persona, right? And then use humor to play that persona. But then you have others who defy and push against those stereotypical expectations. So, like Joan Malinsky is a perfect example, or Joan Rivers, right? Who on the one hand, she is very much pushing back against sort of the expectations of like, and Sarah Silverman would be another example of somebody like this who you would not expect these things to come out of her mouth, right? So she presents as like a sort of Joan Rivers in particular, like very well dressed, has a certain presentation, and then says things that are incongruous with what your expectations are. Some I didn't talk about Marvelous Mrs. Maisel. I just had a little reference to Maisel. It's probably based on the stand-up comedian, most based on actually Jean Carroll. And Jean Carroll is another example of somebody who comes up in the 1950s and early 60s and defies the conventions of sort of in like heavily domesticated American society of that time, what a woman should be doing. Like instead of saying a woman should be at home raising the kids, as might have been the expectation in America in the 1950s. No, here's a woman who's on stage who is making you laugh, but pushing against the boundaries of the expectations of what you would have. And I think we still see that to the present day, sort of pushing against expectations and gender expectations.
Avi, thank you so much. This has been genial. Great.
Let me say that this is Taka and Mechaye. This is, it's a real pleasure. And I want to wish everybody a gut, gesund und shalom dekayo, a good, healthy, and peaceful new year.